Right, this is an excerpt from the 9/11 Commission. It's co-chair Lee Hamilton interviewing National Security Advisor under George Bush, Condoleezza Rice. Let's see what they have to say.
Dr. Rice, you've given us a very strong statement with regard to the actions taken by the administration in this pre-9/11 period, and we appreciate that very much for the record. I want to call to your attention some comments and some events on the other side of that question and give you an opportunity to respond. You know very well that the Commission is focusing on this whole question of what priority did the Clinton administration and the Bush administration give to terrorism. The President told Bob Woodward that he did not feel that sense of urgency. I think that's a quote from his book, or roughly a quote from Woodward's book. The Deputy Director for Central Intelligence, Mr. McLaughlin, told us that he was concerned about the pace of policymaking in the summer of 2001, given the urgency of the threat. The Deputy Secretary of State, Mr. Armitage, was here and expressed his concerns about the speed of the process. And if I recall his comment, it is, we weren't going fast enough. I think that's a direct quote. There was no response to the Cole attack in the Clinton administration and none in the Bush administration. Your public statements focused largely on China and Russia and missile defense. You did make comments on terrorism, but they were connected, the link between terrorism and the rogue regimes like North Korea and Iran and Iraq.
This just goes to show you that the Bush administration was woefully inept regarding the growing threat of Arab fundamentalism from Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda and their affiliates like Jemaah Islamiyah and the Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines and Indonesia, as well as, which later would come to an issue, sympathizers in Saudi Arabia, right? So we have a number of issues regarding terrorist attacks. Now, I mean, in 1993, the FBI rushed to judgment and said that the threat was over, but you had like a fireman, for example, a retired fireman named Ronnie Bucca from Manhattan, who basically created his own chart with terrorists on it, and the threat was expansive because he went to Ramsey Yousef's trial and he tried to connect the dots, and he did, and the FBI didn't take him seriously when he showed him this information. Either the FBI totally ignored Bucca, or they basically were just didn't want to address the issue because they were understaffed and it would cause a headache. And by then, the FBI was more concentrated on La Cosa Nostra here in New York, which is the Italian mafia. So you have that to deal with, as well as the Clinton administration. Now, the Clinton administration and his National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, they basically took a very serious role with Al-Qaeda. That's because he had very good advisors like Richard Clark for the Counterterrorism Center, National Counterterrorism Center. George Tenet became the DCI at the CIA. And of course, the FBI continued their investigation into the 1998 East Africa bombings, which really put Al-Qaeda on the map. And then, of course, the USS Cole bombing in the year 2000. So Clinton, at least, took the issue seriously. When Bush came to office in 2000, it wasn't even on the menu. And in fact, Richard Clark, who was a holdover from the Clinton administration, was allowed to stay with the Bush administration. It was Condoleezza Rice who basically put Clark on the back burner. Clark used to go to the principals meetings, but he wasn't allowed in the Bush administration. He was doing it for Clinton. Clinton actually would make him sometimes lead at the principal meetings because he respected his work and his tenacity, and he actually saw the threat. But Clinton was inactive. He basically didn't take action against bin Laden, which would have basically, if he would have uh, listened to Michael Scheuer, which is, his armchair quarterbacking now, he basically 9/11 wouldn't have happened, maybe. So we don't know if they would have assassinated bin Laden in the, mid 1990s. Anyway, when the Bush administration came in, Arab fundamentalism and the threat of Al Qaeda was not a high priority at all.
And by
Not at all.
our count here, there were some 100 meetings by the national security principals before the first meeting was held on terrorism, September 4th. And General Shelton, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said that terrorism had been pushed farther to the back burner. Now, this is what we're trying to assess. We have your statements, we have these other statements, and I know, as I indicated in my opening comments, how difficult the role of the policymaker is and how many things press upon you. But I did want to give you an opportunity to comment on some of these other matters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin with the Woodward quote, because that has gotten a lot of press, and I actually think that the quote, put in context, gives a very different picture. The question that the President was asked by Mr. Woodward was, did you want to have bin Laden killed before September 11th? That was the question. The President said, well, I hadn't seen a plan to do that. I knew that we needed to, I think the appropriate word is bring him to justice. And of course, this is something of a trick question in that notion of self-defense, which is appropriate for, I think you can see here, a president struggling with whether he ought to be talking about pre-9/11 attempts to kill bin Laden. And so that is the context for this quote. And quite frankly, I remember the director sitting here and saying he didn't want to talk about authorities on assassination. I think you can understand the discomfort of the president. The president goes on when Bob Woodward says, well, I don't mean it as a trick question. I'm just trying to get your state of mind. The president says, let me put it this way. There was a significant difference in my attitude after September 11th. I was not on point, but I knew he was a menace and I knew he was a problem. I knew he was responsible. We felt he was responsible for bombings that had killed Americans, and I was prepared to look at a plan that would be a thoughtful plan that would bring him to justice and would have given the order to do just that. I have no hesitancy about going after him, but I didn't feel that sense of urgency, and my blood was not nearly as boiling. Whose blood was nearly as boiling prior to September 11th? And I think the context helps here. It is also the case that the President had been told by the Director of Central Intelligence that it was not going to be a silver bullet to kill bin Laden, that you had to do much more. And in fact, I think that some of us felt that the so much focus on what you did with bin Laden, not what you did with the network, not what you did with the regional circumstances, might in fact have been misplaced. So I think the President is responding to a specific set of questions. All that I can tell you is that what the President wanted was a plan to eliminate al-Qaeda so he could stop swatting at flies. He knew that we had in place the same crisis management mechanism, indeed the same personnel, that the Clinton administration, which clearly thought it a very high priority, had in place. And so
well, that's not necessarily the case. Okay, for example, after 9/11, and it's just always happening after an event, right? He took this issue seriously. So what happened was that throughout the summer of 2001, you had the CIA and you had other agencies, foreign even, dignitaries coming to Bush, sending him information about an impending attack. And this is the conspiracy, right? The conspiracy is that Bush was woefully unprepared. Now, the information was enormous, right? Now, the details of the operation was not known. But the warnings were there. Bin Laden is determined to strike inside the United States. That was the headline of the Presidential Daily Brief of August 6, 2001, given by the CIA. Okay? Now, it didn't mention anything about an attack on the World Trade Center, Pentagon, specifically on September 11th. But it did say that bin Laden was preparing for a large-scale attack inside the United States. Now, that you had other countries such as Canada, Germany, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and some of these countries' information was vague, but the warning signs were there, right? Bin Laden is going to attack the United States. Then you have the FBI with the Phoenix memo. Even though it came late, it was still there. It wasn't read by many people. It was only read by a select few. Bush didn't read it until I think a month later or something like that, or I think a couple of months later. So none of the security measures were enforced, knowing that an attack is going to take place regarding, say, airport security and immigration. Don't vet, cares about vetting these people who can't afford to offend the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And then you had foreign intelligence services from the Mossad and the Saudi GID inside the United States who are monitoring these people without the knowledge of the FBI or the State Department. So you have a problem there as well. So it just seems that Rice is basically trying to cover up the fact that the Bush administration pre 9/11 didn't take the threat of Al-Qaeda seriously. And that's a fact. That's a fact. That's coming from multiple testimonies, including the most important of all, Richard Clark. Basically said this. Bob Woodward mentioned in this book. That's what Lee Hamilton was referring to.
I
So
think that
this threat of Al-Qaeda was known even back in 1999.
he saw the priority as continuing the current operations and then getting a plan in place. Now, as to the number of PCs, I'm sorry, there's some difference in our records here. We show 33 Principals Committee meetings during this period of time, not 100. We show that 3 of those dealt with issues, at least partially with issues dealing with terrorism not related to Al-Qaeda. And so we can check the numbers, but we have looked at our files and we show 33, not 100. The quotes by others about how the process was moving, again, it's important to realize that we had parallel tracks here.
Well, funny because Tenet actually, who lied under oath there in the 9/11 Commission, basically how many times he met Bush in the month of August, he said 0. Meanwhile, it was 3 times. He met him, I think, an additional 5 times in the months of September, right before the attacks took place on September 11th. So I don't know what Rice is
Continuing to
doing.
do what the Clinton administration had been doing under all the same authorities that were operating. George Tenet was continuing to try to disrupt Al-Qaeda. We were continuing the diplomatic efforts. But we did want to take the time to get in place a policy that was more strategic toward Al-Qaeda, more robust. It takes some time to think about how to reorient your policy toward Pakistan. It takes some time to think about how to have a more effective policy toward Afghanistan. It particularly takes some time when you don't get your people on board for...
Well, you had a policy for Afghanistan even before 9/11 happened. I mean, the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, went to, I think, his Waristan well before the attacks took place, warning about an Afghanistan invasion. You were actually trying to deal with, well, maybe not you personally, but the White House was actually trying to make a deal with the Taliban about allowing a transatlantic pipeline to run through the country. And one of the beneficiaries of it was Enron, the disgraced energy company in Texas, led by Ken Lay, and who was friends with the Bush family. So, I mean, and that deal fell apart because the Taliban thought, you weren't being very, providing very beneficial terms, which would benefit the Taliban for allowing this to happen. And then they threatened to blow up the pipelines. And that was incidentally just a week or 2 prior to 9/11. And look what they did. Right?
for
A lot of coincidences with 9/11.
several months. So I understand that there are those who have said they felt it wasn't moving along fast enough. I talked to George Tenet about this at least every couple of weeks, sometimes more often. How can we move forward on the Predator? What do you want to do about the Northern Alliance? So I think we were putting the energy into it. And I should just make one.
You didn't do anything about the Northern Alliance, right? You allowed them to be overrun by the Taliban and his affiliates like Hezbollah Islami, led by Gulbuddin Ekbatar. Ahmad Shah Massoud, the leader of the Northern Alliance, actually went to France months prior to 9/11, I think somewhere in the late winter months in 2001, late early winter months, like in February, or March or something like that. And he actually pleaded with the world and said that the United States needs to step in and help us, or else Al Qaeda will threaten the United States because they're in Afghanistan being given refuge by the Taliban. And basically, the CIA basically did not, even though they liked Massoud, they respected him, but there was a split inside the CIA regarding providing any material assistance for the Northern Alliance. And Massoud was actually assassinated by the two Al Qaeda operatives posing as media, Tunisian media, I think, on September 9th, 2 days before 9/11.
Another point, Mr. Hamilton, if you
So Bush didn't do nothing for Massoud.
don't mind, which is that we also moved forward on some of the specific ideas that Dick Clark had put forward prior to completing the strategy review. We increased assistance to Uzbekistan, for instance, which had been one of the recommendations. We moved along the armed predator, the development of the armed predator. We increased counterterrorism funding. But there were a couple of things that we did not want to do. I'm now convinced that while nothing that in this strategy would have done anything about 9/11, if we had in fact moved on the things that were in the original memos that we got from our counterterrorism people, we might have even gone off course, because it was very Northern Alliance focused. That was going to cause a huge problem with Pakistan. It was not going to put us in the center of action in Afghanistan, which is the South. And so we simply had to take some time to get this right. But I think we need not confuse that with either what we did during the threat period, where we were urgently working the operational issues every day, or with the continuation of the Clinton policy.
Well, I thank you for a careful answer. Another question.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, of course, we were unable to protect our people. And you suggest in your statement, and I want you to elaborate on this if you want to, that in hindsight it would have been better information about the threats, would have been the single most important thing for us to have done from your point of view prior to 9/11 would have been better intelligence, better information about the threats. Is that right?
Really?
Are there other things that you think?
You had intelligence, right? You had intelligence, even though it was vague, oftentimes, right? But the pertinent intelligence was withheld from you. And this is the reason why you're having these hearings, is because the intelligence agencies, like the NSA and the CIA, the two main culprits here, who basically intentionally withheld. Okay, we have established this during the hearings. They intentionally withheld information to the FBI and the State Department, right? The leading principals of the White House intentionally withheld. So they had no idea. And whether they didn't want to know or they basically just were ignorant because nobody was sharing information. I don't know. I can't go that route. I can't basically say, yeah, the White House basically didn't want to look at it because they wanted the attacks to happen. Or they just, knew an attack was happening and basically said, well, it would be beneficial, and the foreign policy analyst of the neocon department basically said, allow the attacks to happen so our foreign policy plans could, implement. Those are reasonable scenarios, but it doesn't work like that, right? So basically it goes by intelligence. It goes about plausible deniability, okay? The intelligence is not shared. That means the principals that the White House could basically say, hey, we didn't know an attack was coming because the intelligence agency, but now you can see why there's going to be a lack of a person or an agency to blame. And in this case, the blaming was for the CIA and the FBI and barely anything for the NSA, which is, I think, the major culprit here. And of course, no one's talking about the foreign intelligence services, Saudi Arabia and Israel, because we're protecting those interests. So someone has to fall on the sword. Well, in these hearings, it was the CIA, and then the FBI, and then, not even the NSA. So the CIA basically fell on the sword, but nobody got fired. In fact, Tenet got promoted. He got the Presidential Award, Medal of Honor, I think, Medal of Freedom, it's called, or something like that. He got a medal. And he also got a blank check, as well as the NSA did. And of course, guess who profited off 9/11? Well, a foreign policy analyst in the neocon department led under Dick Cheney, and of course, the NSA, the Patriot Act, the CIA basically did. So did the FBI and every other intelligence agency domestically, from the executive branch to the judicial branch to even small towns. So that's who benefited, not the American people. They basically gave up their civil liberties and they continued to do so. So there is the problem at hand, right? It's all about intelligence. Whoever has intelligence, whoever has information, is the most powerful entity on the block. I will always say it. The most powerful agencies in the world are the intelligence agencies, because their job is to collect intelligence, whether it's signals intelligence, human intelligence, either one. And the NSA, the CIA, the DIA, these are the most powerful entities in the United States. I think the most,
Stand out.
bar none.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I took an oath of office on the day that I took this job to protect and defend. And like most government officials, I took it very seriously. And so, as you might imagine, I've asked myself 1,000 times what more we could have done. I know that had we thought that there was an attack coming in Washington or New York, we would have moved heaven and earth to try and stop it. And I know that there was no single thing that might have prevented that attack. In looking back, I believe that the absence of light, so to speak, on what was going on inside the country, the inability to connect the dots, was really structural.
In the 1993 World Trade Center attacks, the FBI had information about the towers being a target. They didn't stop the bombing. In the Bajinka plot basically gave the blueprint for 9/11. The FBI didn't do anything with this information, even though it was shared, even though they knew that there was operatives here in the early 90s waiting on orders from Osama bin Laden about hijacking numerous aircraft. That was written, and that was from the testimony of Abdul Hakim Murad, who was caught during the Bajinka plot by the Philippines National Police. Then you add the East Africa bombings. And according to the ambassador in Sudan, in Kenya, a U.S. ambassador, she basically said that she was telling her superiors that we needed better security because we were getting information about the embassies being a target for an attack by terrorists. They didn't do that. In Yemen, in the year 2000, the intelligence was Al-Qaeda had the largest base outside of Afghanistan in Yemen, and they were prepared to attack U.S. naval ships. And this was outlined in the Millennium Plot, where they wanted to bomb a U.S. warship called the USS Sullivan's. But the ship that was carrying these bombs had too much weight of the bombs on the ship, and it sank to the ocean. What happened in October? The USS Cole was bombed. Okay, 9/11. Right? None of these operations, most of them could have been stopped, prevented at least, or better secured. Nothing happened. So the only two operations that didn't happen was Bajinka and Millennium. That's it.
We couldn't be dependent.
And that's because with Bajinka, we basically got lucky because Yusuf and Murad they caused a chemical spill. It was just by accident. And with the Millennium Plot, that wasn't from the United States. That was from Jordanians. They intercepted a phone call between Abu Zubaydah and somebody else, some other notable, I can't think of his name, the Jordanian extremist. They heard a phone call about an operation and they were given approval. So it wasn't even the United States who stopped these two operations from happening.
On chance
Philippines with
that
Bajinka.
something might come
Jordanians with
together,
Millennium.
and the legal impediments and the bureaucratic impediments, but I want to emphasize the legal impediments to keep the FBI and the CIA from functioning really as one, so that there was no seam between domestic and foreign intelligence, was probably the greatest one. the Director of Central Intelligence and I think Director Free had an excellent relationship. They were trying hard to bridge that seam. I know that Louis Free had developed legal attaches abroad to try to help bridge that. But when it came right down to it, this country, for reasons of history and culture and therefore law, had an allergy to the notion of domestic intelligence, and we were organized on that basis, and it just made it very hard to have all of the pieces come together. We've made good changes since then. I think that having a Homeland Security Department that can bring together the FAA and the INS and Customs and all of the various agencies is a very important step. I think that the creation of the Terrorism Threat Information Center, which brings together all of the intelligence from various aspects, is a very important step forward. Clearly, the Patriot Act, which has allowed the kind of sharing, indeed demands the kind of sharing between intelligence agencies, including the FBI and the CIA, is a very big step forward. I think one thing that we will learn from you is whether the structural work is done.
Final question would be, one of your sentences kind of jumped out at me in your statement, and that was on page 9 where you said, we must address the source of the problem. I'm very concerned about that.
Well, oh man, wow. The source of the problem? Well, let's start with the inability to execute on assassination plots of bin Laden during the Clinton administration. The inactive or the outright dismissal of taking Al Qaeda seriously during the Bush administration. Now let's talk about the CIA. Well, the CIA has been a problem since they were created. So there's one problem. Also, let's just keep it recent. The CIA basically were the ones who went to the Clinton administration, basically proposed ideas to assassinate bin Laden. I'll give them that much credit. However, they were inactive, indecisive in doing so. And that came from not just the CIA, but Clinton as well and his advisors, like Sandy Berger. Regarding the Bush administration, now it gets worse. So under DCI Tennant and Cofer Black, who was named the Counterterrorism Center, and then Richard Blee, who's head of the Bin Laden Issue Station, they basically withheld information from the FBI and State Department regarding Al Qaeda inside the United States. Why did they do that? Why did they do that? Well, according to Tennant, Black, and Tom Wilshire, the deputy director, second in command at Bin Laden Issue Station, when they testified before the Joint House Inquiry, they basically gave 3 conflicting answers. Okay, and now I have that as a podcast on the Darkened Hour about that. And I think people should listen to that to hear each answer from these 3 people and why it's so important to hold them accountable, right? Then you have the NSA. The NSA actually had the most information regarding Al Qaeda than any agency in the world. They were listening to a phone call, the phone calls of Bin Laden's satellite phone for 6 years. And of course, they were listening to the phone calls of Al Qaeda communications hub in Sana'a, Yemen, all right, for I think 5 years. Okay. What do you think they were talking about on those phones? All right. They didn't share that information with anybody that we know of. Okay. So, I mean, what else do we need who do we need to blame? The FBI's inadmissive or dismissal of taking Al Qaeda seriously? Well, there's some people that did take it seriously and they weren't listened to. Well, Ali Soufan, for example, Mark Rossini, Doug Miller, Ken Williams, Robert Wright Jr., but some of those people had their flaws, but I mean, my God, they were trying to blow the whistle about getting the State Department to take the Bush administration anyway, to take Al Qaeda seriously, and their superiors in Minnesota, in Arizona, in New York, basically ignored them. Chicago, were just suppressed, the threat anyway.
And I was pleased to see
So yeah, there's a lot of blame. What God sakes.
it in, and I'm very worried about the threat of terrorism, as I know you are, over a very long period of time, a generation or more. There are a lot of very, very fine, 2 billion Muslims. Most of them we know are very fine people. Some don't like us, they hate us. They don't like what modernization does to their culture. They don't like the fact that economic prosperity is passed. Them by. They don't like some of the policies of the United States government. They don't like the way their own governments treat them. And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit, if you would, on how we get at the source of the problem. How do we get at this discontent, this dislocation, if you would, across a big swath of the Islamic world?
I believe very strongly, and the President believes very strongly, that this is really the generational challenge. The kinds of issues that you are addressing have to be addressed, but we're not going to see success on our watch. We will see some small victories on our watch. One of the most difficult problems in the Middle East is that the United States has been associated for a long time, decades, with a policy that looks the other way on the freedom deficit in the Middle East, that looks the other way at the absence of individual liberties in the Middle East. And I think that that has tended to alienate us from the populations of the Middle East. And when the President at Whitehall in London said that that was no longer going to be the stance of the United States, we were expecting more from our friends. We were going to try and engage those in those countries who wanted to have a different kind of Middle East. I believe that he was resonating with trends that are there in the Middle East. There are reformist trends in places like Bahrain and Jordan. And recently there was a marvelous conference in Alexandria in Egypt where reform was actually on the agenda. So it's going to be a slow process. We know that the building of democracy is tough. It doesn't come easily. We have our own history. You know, when our founding fathers said, "We the people," they didn't mean me. It's taken us a while to get to a multi-ethnic democracy that works. But if America is avowedly values-centered in its foreign policy, we do better than when we do not stand up for those values. So I think that it's going to be very hard. It's going to take time. One of the things that we've been very interested, for instance, in is issues of educational reform in some of these countries. As you know, the madrasas are a big difficulty. I've met myself personally 2 or 3 times with the Pakistani wonderful woman who's the Pakistani education minister. We can't do it for them. They have to do it for themselves, but we have to stand for those values. And over the long run, we will change, I believe we will change the nature of the Middle East, particularly if there are examples that this can work in the Middle East. And this is why Iraq is so important. The Iraqi people are struggling to find a way to create a multi-ethnic democracy that works. And it's going to be hard. And if we stay with them, and when they succeed, I think we will have made a big change. They will have made a big change in the middle of the Arab world, and we will be
you also have the Gulf lobby. Basically, they're the rich lobby, um, the money lobby. Israel is a poor state. Saudi Arabia is quite rich, and they're the ones who throw tens of millions at these ghouls in the Congress or Democrats, Republicans. They don't care. These are pimps. These are actually prostitutes. That's what they are. The Democrats, Republicans, all they are. Sellouts. Will sell each other out for the prime dollar, the highest dollar. Oh, changing policy in the Middle East. That's what you think, Dr. Rice? Well, guess what? You basically changed Iraq forever, Afghanistan forever, Syria forever, Libya forever, Pakistan to an extent, Yemen forever. And the only country you didn't do was Iran, because Iran's the more formidable country, right? And the generals in the Pentagon basically don't want that war because they are a formidable standing army, and the geographics of the country are not favorable for a ground invasion for the American troops, especially south of the country, which is mountains. And the region itself is untenable for any type of movements toward the capital. So, I mean, you basically did change the shape of the Middle East forever. The Bush administration did, and they basically created more terrorists than they killed because of their disastrous foreign policy. And that's the problem here, right? It's nothing to do with religious freedoms or the lack thereof. It has everything to do with our foreign policy, domestic and foreign. When I say foreign, talk about Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. They're Gulf partners, because these are the people who basically influence our country's government at the Senate, the House, White House level. They've been doing so for decades. And when you get rid of this influence and you start having an honest government, which is a pipe dream, of course, then we could start working at a true hegemony in the region. All right, I'll stop it right there. Have a good day, guys.